Therapists of Reddit, what was your biggest "I know I'm not supposed to judge you but holy shit" moment? I was counseling a 13-year-old girl for anxiety and she reported sexual abuse from her stepdad. I called her mom and told her mother I needed to call Child Protective Services. Turns out that CPS was already aware and the abuse was first reported around the patient's age 7. Mom was aware of the abuse and stayed with her husband anyway. It was a complicated situation. And it wasn't. How could she not do more to protect her daughter? Sorry lady. I'm judging. My professor once shared what a patient said that made her quit her job. I didn't pay my daughter. She liked it. The daughter was 6. She couldn't take it anymore. She worked in a rehabilitation center for people who have been sentenced for serious crimes and were forced to get mental help. Really difficult job and this pushed her over the edge. Once had a patient whose wife shook their baby to death. He wanted help reconnecting with his wife. At the time I was a young father of a newborn myself. And he triggered a lot of fear in me for my own child. A deep loathing of his spouse. And pity, the how pathetic kind, for the patient. I tried for 3 sessions. Met his spouse and everything before handing the case over to my supervisor, who knew about my initial reactions. And tried to help me through it. Unfortunately, it ended up being more about my feelings than his. And I was new to the profession at the time. These things are expected to crop up from time to time. But I was still taken aback by my own reactions. I do acute pediatric inpatient behavioral therapy. Has never happened with a child. And never will. Parents on the other hand can be real pieces of. And the way they abuse their children then throw them off on us and scream fix them. I was once in my psychiatrist's office YASA monthly. 15 minutes med check. She asked me what was going on some more as conversation. I told her that in the last 6 weeks. I 3 elders, aunt and 2 uncles. I was guardian conservator for had DDoS own right after the other. My wife had a heart attack. My daughter attempted suicide. And my mom broke her hip and had laid on her floor for a week before being found. She drank and ate from the dog's bowls. I got that call within 10 minutes of setting up the last funeral. She stopped the meeting. Got on the phone with a therapist in the office next to her and had her postpone her next meeting to speak with me. I was so ed up. I had no idea. I think she saved my life. I feel like a lot of the comments saying that they never judge their clients might be working in voluntary services or they've been very fortunate in their client base. Judgment isn't an inherently bad thing. It's how we know that murdering people is wrong. So when a convicted pedophile client told me, "Nothing gets me going like a pair of little girls' worn panties," you better believe I judged the out of him. I continued to work with him and I treated him with compassion and respect because he is a human being worthy of both. I did my job because I'm a professional. But I can't honestly say that I didn't judge him. I judge that he should never be around children. I judge that he is not yet ready for change. I judge that his access to his own daughter should be closely supervised. That's a lot of judgments. Understanding your own inherent biases and how they influence your work is a very important part of training and practice. Here's my most recent one. As the pandemic worsened here in the US and more lockdowns are on their way, one of my most extroverted clients and I brainstormed ways to meet her social needs while remaining safe. The following week she cancelled her session and told me that she's positive for COVID after attending an orgy. Which definitely wasn't one of our ideas. I let out the deepest, most defeated sigh after I hung up the phone. I work with kiddos who have experienced some kind of abuse trauma. 90% of my clients have been sexually abused. I have a lot of holy moments, but not from judgment of my clients but from what happened to them. I've had clients whose father made them help him dismember mom's body after dad murdered her in front of them. I've had clients under the age of 8 who have been sex trafficked. I've had clients who have been forced to film torture PRN. I have holy moments all the time. I joined in a review of a secluded patient and he threw a cup of wee and poo in my face when we opened the door. I tried to be objective about his experience, but I just thought, what a... I work in inpatient services, so it can be hard to challenge myself at times. Individuals with diagnosis of personality disorder, for example, can do things that in isolation make you think they're just being bratty or manipulative. But to think of the experiences that shape them to react like that in a given situation can help to clear my judgment and find compassion. But harder when someone bites me or hits me with one of our fabulously detachable anti-ligature curtain poles. Though I work at a residential group home. We had a kid who we had admitted about 4 months prior. When in a family session they mentioned they had parasites. I'm like, what? Mom goes, oh yeah, our whole family has them. We don't believe in getting rid of them since they're part of our biological ecosystem, and I'm just dumbstruck. We spent 3 weeks afterwards convincing this family it was an infectious disease concerns, as other residents have fecal eating behaviors and various other unsanitary issues that could cause a unit spread. 3 weeks of education, planning, and worst of all convincing this kid and mother that their IQ wouldn't drop because they had agreed to irradiate the parasites. Lots of CBT work. But Jesus, it took way longer than any of my team expected. Clinical psychologist working primarily in forensics here. This means my clients are usually involved in legal proceedings, family court, juvenile court, criminal court, etc. My job is usually to evaluate or provide treatment. I'm not there to judge. That's the judge's job. But of course I have my thoughts. I am usually impressed by the justifications people make for Thai behavior. The one that irks me the most is when parents manipulate their child against the other parent. I've had to do therapy for a 5-year-old who said she doesn't want to see a parent because they haven't paid child support. Excuse me? What 5-year-old knows, understand, or needs to be worried about child support? Opposite side. If that's accepted too? I was assigned to see the lead psychologist of the local hospital as I was severely depressed and had become suicidal. She literally rolled her eyes at me, told me to grow up, and said she could be having appointments with people who were actually about to kill themselves. Not me, who was already working with a team. This sent me absolutely spinning. Bottling everything up, thinking I didn't deserve help, and ended up in hospital 2 years later after an attempt. When they looked at my records, the hospital suddenly became very interested in any psychological experts I'd previously spoken to. Informed them of the above incident. They asked if I knew the name and I said I didn't. But they had a strong accent. They immediately looked like they were about to burst out crying. Apologized excessively, then informed me they had been fired a year ago. No idea how many people were affected by that therapist. It's not often I get to talk about my profession, but here goes. I was working at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center and had a client come in who was a self-proclaimed drug lord. As we worked together, he told me about his history. Included in this history was how he got to where he was currently at. During the conversation, this man admitted to selling his sister into sex slavery, forcibly injecting her with several sedatives and narcotics, and having several people teach her a lesson. What this meant, he never shared. He told this story with a blank face, smiling only when he recalled the good times, which he referred to as times when he had enough heroin to get through the day. I'm not sure where he is at now, but this man inspired me to work with victims of sex trafficking. Because not only do they deal with the stigma of selling their bodies, they often manage drug addictions. People would honestly be floored if they realized how many people were addicted to chemicals that they were forcibly given. OP. You mentioned you're getting ready to start therapy. I know we're different, but therapy was one of the best decisions I ever made for myself. It's good to have a neutral third party weigh in on what troubles you. And remember, you don't have to stay with a therapist if you don't want. Therapy, like any psychological treatment, is often more about trial and error to find what works for the individual than anything. Also, you'll get out of it what you put in. So be upfront, frank and honest with your therapist. That will help them work with you on determining the best therapy course for you. I wish you the best of luck. Just checking in that nobody wrote my story. When I was underage, I got caught with a drink on Bourbon Street and got a minor in possession. I was telling my therapist about it and said that the police caught me with a hand grenade in New Orleans. He didn't realize that a hand grenade was a type of drink. And it was funny to watch him try to process that his patient might have just casually told him that he had been caught with a fragmentation grenade. He took a big long pause and said, "Where did you even find a grenade?" I realized the misunderstanding quickly and corrected him. But for a moment he definitely was thinking, holy, how do I deal with this? Well, I quit my last therapist because I made him cry uncontrollably. He tried not to, but he just couldn't hold it back. I felt guilty and won't see him anymore. I think he may have lost a child before. I described watching my aunt grieve over her son's body. I felt so much pain losing him, but was explaining how watching my aunt was dramatically worse. The details about her is what made him lose it. I could tell he was reliving something inside his own head. Too many goddamn responsible professionals. I came here to read the salacious stories of how some docs went ham on patients and lost their certifications. Instead, all I've gained is even more respect than I already had for the backbreaking and sometimes thankless hard work these individuals do every day. Work I could never do. Not with any consistency anyway. Responsible jerks. Therapist here. To piggyback on what others have said, it is highly unlikely for me to have moments where I judge my clients. It happens sometimes, but I'm able to shut down those thoughts quickly in my head and return to being present for the people I see. People are so incredibly complex that my judgment wouldn't have any meaning anyway, and it doesn't have a place in our work together. I will admit though, something that does get me feeling a little salty is when I have a client's parent that attempts to sabotage the therapeutic relationship I have with their child. Or pulling them out of therapy entirely when some of the things we talk about challenges some potentially unhealthy family dynamics. I don't feel anger toward the parents. Mostly I feel bad for the kid. Edit. Whoa. All I have to say is that I am incredibly humbled by all of you that have shared your stories. Even though these moments are so steeped in pain. What hits me is the incredible amount of strength present in spite of the upbringing and parents many of you have had. A woman who deliberately kept getting pregnant because she enjoyed the attention. And then would immediately afterwards dump her kids with the foster system, or in one case a willing relative. She had 6 kids at the time I met her. Patient side here. I had been seeing a therapist for a few months to help with chronic depression and self-harm with some pretty intense suicidal ideation. I had tried Suprax in the past. Didn't like the side effects and put it down. But I was ready to try something new to supplement therapy. Everyone within earshot was calling Wellbutrin a miracle and lifesaver. So I figured I'd give it a shot. Since my therapist couldn't prescribe drugs, I got an appointment with a psychiatrist. My first appointment. I explain what I've got going on, what I'm doing to work on it, and what I'm looking for in seeing him. I do a pretty good job holding myself together in public. I dress myself. I hold down jobs. At that point I lived on my own, now living with my partner. All in all, I've got a well-polished mask. I guess it's too good. Because pretty early in our session he looked at me and said, "I don't think you're depressed. Bro. This is the first time we met. I've been here for 20 minutes. And you're ready to reverse my diagnosis? Cool, bro." When you as a therapist get to that point, it's time to start thinking of referrals. Be genuine with your client. And then refer out. You have to have unconditional positive regard or you'll never achieve therapeutic rapport. I think for me, the one that comes to mind is a frequent caller to the suicide hotlines. He'd call in and say he's not providing his phone number or name. He would just say that you had 10 seconds to convince him not to kill himself over the phone. Or he'd blow his brains out and it'd be your fault. Then he'd count down from 10 to 1 while you're on the phone talking. At 1, he'd hang up. I'm sure the whole point was to make me feel bad or prove some point. I don't know. I have insufficient information to make an assessment with just that. But I have to admit, when I was trying to sleep on days he'd call, especially the first time, I was thinking, "Ein arsehole better not be dead." During my training I was asked, how would you feel if a client were to come to you and admitted they were a pedophile that was on the edge of committing seriously horrific acts? Could you see that person as another human being that needed help? Or were your personal feelings about the abhorrent behavior too strong? This factor leads some people to not continue my course on to the next level. But it really illustrates the level of non-judgment needed in this field. We all have our own personal feelings, of course, but these get talked about in supervision. Edit. Wow, thanks for the awards. I'm glad it's raised an interesting topic for discussion. I'm enjoying reading them all, even if I don't have the time to reply. Personally, in this instance I remember the Gandhi quote, "Hate the sin, not the sinner." Also spelling. I work in healthcare and I've never heard a therapist, psychologist, or psychiatrist judge patients openly. Other nurses and doctors, on the other hand, holy. At some of the clinics I've been in, the conversations in the break room and at the nurses station blew my mind. That's why I don't work in a hospital anymore. I was a PCA and the judgment from everyone was insane. Nurses would wait until the last possible minutes to give a patient their pain meds because they were exaggerating, and yet I would be in their room 3 times an hour and they would be writhing in pain. People openly talked about patients badly. Not a judgment. You kind of train your brain not to judge, because you are seeking to understand and help. When you do those things, you can't simultaneously judge. We could all use a little more of that in real life, I suppose. I'll share this though. I do feel concerned about this recent phenomenon of young people I worked with self-diagnosing, sharing, and identifying very closely with mental illness. As if the pendulum quickly swung from never ever share your feelings to OMG, you're depressed? All of us are too. Life's challenges can be tough and they don't need a scientific sounding label to be valid and real. You are not your diagnosis. We can find validation and support in healthier ways. Edit. Thank you for the golden awards. And thanks to everyone for some really nice discussion. Not a therapist but a patient. Me and my fiance registered sign. At the time, went in to see if we could figure out how to make things work after he hit me. After our history came out and I divulged his infidelity etc, the therapist basically said no. There's no hope. You need to get help for yourself so you can get the courage to leave and end this. I was angry at the time, but both therapists knew there was no point as he was as screwed up as it gets. I now work in the jail and there are quite a few sex offenders in my program. I struggle with the ones who honestly believe they're victims, as young as 8, were in mutual loving relationships with them. It's super difficult at times not to just say dude. WTF. 2 contexts come to mind. I often work with people in abusive relationships and it is incredibly common for people to go back to their abusive partners after leaving. Some studies show the average number of times someone goes back before leaving for good is 7 times. I know why people go back and I get that it's often a combination of manipulation, financial control, gaslighting, love, low self-esteem, fear, etc. But, man, it is hard to watch and appear neutral. I can say I am worried about their safety but I can't yell for their sake. Stop going back. What is it going to take? Like I want to. The other situation isn't really judging the person, it's more judging OCD. But OCD is weird. The infinitely weird ways it can show up are so funny and bizarre. Again, I would never judge a person for having the intrusive thoughts they have or doing the compulsions that are somehow linked in their mind to those obsessions. But I absolutely judge OCD and constantly marvel at how creative and weird the human brain can be. Therapist here. I don't think I've ever judged clients. My job is to understand them and their experiences and help them make the improvements they are ready to make. But I have very directly made my thoughts clear about choices. Especially choices parents make for about their kids. This probably comes off as judgment depending on the client's insecurity about the topic. One example was telling parents of a child I was working with a severe mood disorder that had made both suicidal and homicidal threats and attempts that it did not seem like a good idea to buy the young kid a gun. Especially the week after the mother spent the session sharing her fears that the child would murder her. I just wanna show up when some low effort text to speech channel covers this. Okay. Real therapist here. I got one. Some of my clients are shockingly bad at giving themselves credit. Holy. Like they might get a nearly straight A GPA in a brutal major while battling depression. Or overcome years of phobia and get behind the wheel again. Or write a little novel. Or raise a kid as a single parent with low income. Or build new relationships after being burned. Or cope with OCD well enough to hold down a job. And they'll talk about themselves as if everyone on earth is better than them. As if their accomplishments are worthless. And I know it's because of depression or anxiety or another condition. But I'm often stunned by how differently I see them compared to how they see themselves. Can I answer from the other side? I had something close to a mental breakdown after a painful breakup. Started seeing a therapist. It was going more or less well. At one point I had a sort of revelation about all my bull and about my own responsibility in the whole mess. So next session I'm actually thrilled to share this with the therapist. About how I finally see a bunch of my own problems in the way I interact with women. And which caused a relationship that wasn't really healthy from the get-go. I'm halfway through trying to explain this and the therapist goes, "Oh. You know. Women are weird." So that was that. I never went back. That guy. Obligatory not a therapist and this will probably get buried. But as a Yano man I really struggled with going to therapy. But it was the absolute low point in my life. And I have always dealt with depression but I come from the just get through it mentality. Well. I was closer and closer to not getting through it. I remember the first time I told my therapist that I was planning on killing myself. I expected the same reaction that men showing their emotions and vulnerabilities get. But she never did. Never even acted like it wasn't an option. She just talked me through it. Never acting like my thoughts or feelings were invalid. Sorry. Not exactly the point of the question. But if fear of being judged or anything is holding you back from going, please go. It could save your life. There was a client, a young teenager that was hearing voices to hurt himself. He had multiple crisis calls and was admitted several times to crisis centers for observation until he got prescribed meds and was starting to show improvement. He was starting to disclose that he may have been gay and was stressed out because his father was old school religious and a pillar of the community. The young man was recommended to go to treatment start in a facility to keep him acclimate to meds and just to give him some coping skills and all that. His father pulled him out AMA and refused to allow him to continue medication. He also discontinued his therapy for a more religious approach. 3 months later he completed his suicide. I see that father around and I want to him up. I wish I could. Is seeing a therapist actually worth it? My doctor has been telling me to seek one out for literally years but I don't see how talking is gonna solve anything. Anyone that's been to therapy have any insight? I mean if your doctor is telling you to, I'd say you should give it a try. Therapy works for a lot of people and if it doesn't work for you then you can find something else. Lol, no way. This is a great way to lose a license. Commenting from the opposite viewpoint to this. I have quite severe OCD. With the counselor before my current one, I was just starting to open up about some really embarrassing obsessions. I told him about it. And he laughed. While I was being vulnerable. And nearly in tears. He did try to cover it with a cough. But failed. After that it took over 2 years before I reached out to another therapist. I feel like if you're judging a client, you shouldn't be a therapist. Because you'll cause more harm than good. Not a single actual therapist replies. Because they are moral people and have codes, unlike people of Reddit whom will use anything to gain the imaginary numbers. Not a therapist. A doctor. Had a patient apologize for crying during a consultation, saying, "I know I shouldn't be sad. I've got so many great things going for me." Dude. 3 months ago you had to move back to your parents after an unexpected breakup. Back to the environment which contributed to your official diagnosis. The same place where your sister was living before she died. 1 month after your return to that house. Of the same diagnosis you have. And because she died during a pandemic. Not only could you not visit her in hospital before she died, you had difficulty organizing her funeral. In addition to all that, he felt financially responsible for both his parents as they'd both lost their benefits, a loss which they couldn't appeal as their mental health was so poor the concept of fighting that decision was making them suicidal. I want to hug a lot of my patients, but this one made my heart ache.